All right, so today's screencast continues discussing the concepts related to classical conditioning. Acquisition is the initial stage of conditioning in which the new response is established and gradually strengthened. So when we talk about classical conditioning, and let's use Pavlov's salivating dog experiment as an example, acquisition is that initial stage in which the bell becomes associated with the meat powder. The unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder, brings about a response without any prior training. It brings about a drooling response. No one has to teach the dog or train the dog to drool when the meat powder is placed in his mouth. Well, when Pavlov associated the bell with the meat powder, the bell which was once neutral, after several pairings, gradually produced a drooling response by itself. The neutral stimulus, the bell, became the conditioned stimulus. So acquisition is when those two things, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the bell and the meat powder, become related and become associated, and it gradually strengthens the drooling response in the dog. Often in classical conditioning, as you can see right here, the pairings between the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus must occur several times before it comes to elicit the conditioned response. So the meat powder and the bell must be paired several times before it comes to produce or elicit the drooling response. One exception tends to be what's called taste aversion. Taste aversion is when we associate something negative with a particular event. Acquisition only takes one time because the response is so strong. So taste aversion is when we come to associate something negative with an event. And it makes us less likely that we want to eat that particular food. The word aversion means our dislike or distaste towards something. A lot of us have had bad experiences with certain foods when maybe we've had the stomach flu or food poisoning. And after throwing up and getting sick, we develop what's called a taste aversion to the food. So let's just say you have the stomach flu. Whatever it is that you ate prior to having the stomach flu and throwing up, you develop a taste aversion to that. So maybe it was chicken noodle soup, or maybe it was chili, maybe it was pizza. Well, if you find that even after one unpleasant experience, one time throwing up, let's say, you no longer want to eat chicken noodle soup or pizza or chili or whatever it is that you threw up. This is an evolutionary explanation. It's sometimes referred to as the Garcia effect. John Garcia is one of the names on your vocab sheet who you should associate with taste aversion. He did several studies, some involving mice, and developing taste aversions to different things when they paired it with an unpleasant experience. It doesn't just have to be throwing up. You could hear a really bad story about Taco John's, maybe of something disgusting happening in the back room, and it makes you no longer want to eat Taco Bell, even if it was just a story you heard. Some people developed a taste aversion to McDonald's after hearing, what was the name of that movie, where he only ate McDonald's for so long, for like a month or something. I can't even remember now. But a lot of people who saw that movie developed a taste aversion to McDonald's because they didn't like what they saw in the movie. I had a brother, well, I still have this brother-in-law actually, who as a child had severe migraines. And he actually developed a taste aversion to scrambled eggs after having a migraine right after eating scrambled eggs. Somehow he associated the scrambled eggs with a migraine, which probably had no relationship, but he no longer could eat scrambled eggs. So that's what taste aversion is. And it explains how sometimes acquisition happens after only one pairing, like that of taste aversion, or sometimes multiple pairings need to take place before the conditioned response is strengthened, like that of Pavlov and the salivating dog. Many pairings between the bell and the food had to take place before the dog drooled to the sound of the bell by itself. So one thing you can do to quiz yourself is take a look at this scenario. I had the flu. I ate chili. Now every time I smell chili, I get nauseated. Well, what's the unconditioned stimulus in this taste aversion example? What naturally brings about a response without any prior training? Most people would put the flu. The flu is a stimulus that naturally brings about nausea. Well, what's paired with the flu? What was the once neutral stimulus? The chili. The chili was once neutral, but after being paired with the flu, now just the smell of chili brings about a nauseous feeling. Another concept involved in classical conditioning is what's called generalization. This is the tendency of a new stimulus that is similar to the original stimulus to elicit a response that is similar to the conditioned response. Oh, interruption. Here's an announcement, quick.
It's flying by. Now time to head to fourth hour. Again, students should be leaving third hour at this time and heading to fourth hour. You need to be fourth hour at 2:20. Thank you.
All right. Sorry for that interruption. Now, one story that you may not have read about in your book yet, or one that you may have missed when I lectured in class, was a story about a little boy who was 11 months old. His name was Albert. And a famous psychologist by the name of John Watson and his associate, Rosalie Rayner, actually trained little Albert to fear white furry objects. And what he did in the original experiment was brought this 11-month-old healthy boy into a room. He placed a white rabbit in front of him, and then behind his head made the sound of a really loud clanging noise because he clashed metal upon metal. And little Albert, every time he was presented this white furry rabbit, heard this loud, scary metal noise. So he associated with that scary noise with the white rabbit. And soon, after several pairings, he didn't even have to have the loud, scary noise sounded behind his head. He simply saw the white rabbit, and he started to cower. He started to cry or whimper because he was afraid that something bad was going to happen. Very unethical experiment, highly criticized experiment that was done in the 1920s. Well, what happened with little Albert is they realized that it wasn't just the white rabbits that made him fearful. It was any white furry object. He generalized his fear to include other stimuli that was similar to the original rabbit, like a rat, a man that had a white furry beard, a fur coat, anything furry, especially white furry objects. So that's what's known as generalization. Discrimination is learning to respond to certain stimuli, but not others. So, for example, if little Albert were only fearful to the original stimulus, that of the white rabbit, but not of a man with a furry white beard or a furry white rat, we would call that discrimination. I'm going to give you another example of generalization. I think I told this to one of my classes anyway. When Tommy was a young child, he was stung by a bee. And he heard the buzzing bee flying around his head. It drew his attention, and he actually kind of pinned the bee next to his head and pinned it between his hand and his head. And what was interesting was after that original event, which naturally would make him sad, a bee sting hurts, he generalized his fear of bees to any flying insect that buzzed. So he would become fearful of a mosquito or a housefly. Any buzzing object around his head would make him fearful. That was known as generalization. If I wanted to use that same story with discrimination, when you learn to respond to certain stimuli, yet not others, you could say, for example, if Tommy only was fearful when the insect was a bee, but didn't cower or become sad or fearful when a mosquito or a housefly flew by his head, that would be an example of discrimination. A cute little illustration from your book. I don't care if she's a tape dispenser. I love her. Get it? Get it? All right, let's use this example to identify the different concepts. Here you have a golden retriever jumping up on a little boy. Now every time he simply sees a dog, he whimpers. So see if you can figure out, what is the unconditioned stimulus? What is the stimulus that naturally produces a response without any prior training? Hopefully, you would identify as the golden retriever jumping on the boy. That would naturally make a little boy fearful. The neutral stimulus is simply a dog. The dog was at one time neutral. But now, after being paired with the jumping up on the boy, now just seeing a dog becomes the conditioned stimulus, which produces a fearful response, whimpering. Now, if you're talking about a generalizing stimulus, one that's similar to the original one, golden retriever, you could say any dog. If I'm generalizing, it could be a lab, it could be a Doberman, it could be a Brittany Spaniel, any kind of dog. If you were talking about a discriminating stimulus, you would have to say specifically golden retrievers. That would be the only particular dog that the little boy would be fearful of. Now, there's a concept called extinction. This is the weakening of the conditioned response in absence of the unconditioned stimulus. So let's use little Albert as an example again. That in that original experiment, when they trained this healthy boy to become fearful of white objects by making a really scary loud metal on metal sound behind his head, we can sleep at night, hopefully, knowing that little Albert, once he left the experiment, was able to overcome this fear of white furry objects, because the likelihood that he came across other white furry objects and bad things didn't happen was a very likely situation. And so the weakening of the conditioned response, which was fear, in absence of the unconditioned stimulus, which was the loud noise, allowed for little Albert to eventually overcome his fear of white rabbits or other white furry objects. So extinction would occur. Likewise, if Pavlov kept ringing that bell but didn't place food in the dog's mouth, eventually the dog would no longer respond to the sound of the bell alone. If you found after extinction occurred, the conditioned response reappeared, we call that spontaneous recovery. So let's say Pavlov's dog doesn't get the food placed in his mouth when he hears a bell, and eventually the dog stops drooling to the sound of the bell. Let's say a month after extinction occurred, Pavlov's dog hears a bell and has a drooling response. We call that spontaneous recovery. This is a really nice illustration to show acquisition, the pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, and the drooling response gets stronger. Extinction occurs when you only have the bell alone, the conditioned stimulus, bell, 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 but no food pairing. You can see the drooling response decreases. Then after a pause, after extinction has been established, spontaneous recovery might occur. A random bell ringing produces a drooling response, and eventually extinction happens again. This is another illustration that you guys could test yourself on, the bell and pad method for wetting the bed.